For this series, we're going to be talking a lot about our ethnicity and how that plays into our work and how that might even play into client work or clients that we work with. And so we have different categories that I've split up some facilitated questions for us to talk about. And the first one will be on upbringing. But before we start, I would love, Christina, for you to introduce yourself. Sorry, I also want to mention, and I said I was going to introduce this. For me, I am Taiwanese American. So my parents are from Taiwan, and I grew up in Georgia. And so I feel like for me personally, I kind of have a good mix of both American but also Chinese Taiwanese influence. All right, Christina, what about you?
Hi, my name is Christina Huynh. My government name is Juan. I am Vietnamese American. I've been in the field for almost 20 years. My parents were boat refugees from Vietnam, defected during the Vietnam War, and I was born and raised in Houston. So now I'm currently in Houston right now.
Yeah, great. Um, okay, well, let's get started. So I think the first question I had actually, I'd love to actually start with this is academic pressure versus like clinical passion. So I think like in a lot of Asian households or Asian cultures and families, like we prioritize stability, high status, like our parents want us to be doctors, engineers, lawyers, and I think that's rooted back probably a lot of like, well, they had a really rough life. They want us to be successful. They, want us to be happy because it was really hard for them. So I guess the question I have for us to discuss is for you, Christina, how did your family react to you choosing behavior analysis? Like, did they even know what it was? And did you feel like you had to justify it anyway or fight for like, no, I want to go into this field?
Um, Pretty much. When I told them that I wanted to be in like the psychology field and study psychology in college, they kind of were a little apprehensive about it because they were like, well, at least it's, a doctor type of path. When I first told them I wanted to be an archaeologist, my mom was like, no, you're not never gonna make money out of it. So I had to switch paths. And even as an RBT, when I was going through the field and everything, my mom was still like a little apprehensive because I was coming home with like bite marks and scratches, and and she was like, "Well, I maybe you should like think about." Changing career paths and stuff. And so they kept wanting to push me into the teaching field. And so I told my mom, me being stubborn, I told her, no, I'm just going to stick it out. It's just kids with autism, they don't know how to manage their behaviors and stuff. And so over time, they've grown to understand it. They still kind of feel like, oh, well, Christina studied psychology. She might understand like the mental health. And so, let's you can work with your grandpa who had dementia and things like that. And I was like, no, it doesn't work that way. Same thing with like discussing with autism. And so now my mom and dad still kind of understand it, and they're like, well, now you have your BCBA degree. You should open your own practice. And so they've been pushing me to open my own practice to make money and everything, even trying to get me to get a PhD. And so trying to explain to them, like, there's a lot of nuances when it comes to opening up a practice. So
Yeah.
that's where my my background was.
Huh. Wow. I feel so it kind of sounds like they were fairly relaxed with it. I mean, probably not in the very beginning, but the overall, you think,
Yeah, they were still apprehensive. I mean, for Vietnamese like culture, you either make a lot of money and provide for yourselves, or you get married off in
yeah.
order for your husband to provide for you. And so for me, they were still like on the fence. So by the time like I was in my 30s, they were still like they're like, I don't know if she's gonna survive and be able to provide for themselves for herself. And
Yeah.
so they kept trying to push like marriage on me. So I had to prove myself that I can provide with this field, with my career path and everything. And so now they are understanding of it, and they're like, "Oh, you should talk to so and so who has like a nephew or a child with autism." Um, reaching out to the Vietnamese community in terms of that.
Wow. Okay. I'm honestly really surprised. Well, no, not that surprised, but I think I would say I didn't get like really horrible pressure, but I know when I told my mom what I was pursuing, so I had got a bachelor's in psychology, but then I got an associate's in teaching, and I grew up wanting to be a teacher. Then I discovered ABA, and I was like, "Ooh, I want to go into this and get my master's." And my mom hasn't really directly hated on it, but I think you can tell through the kind of indirect comments, right? That
Yeah.
she's like one, I don't think she understands what ABA is, right? I think that's not a common field in Asian culture. And so even just trying to explain to her what it is a little difficult. But I recall like even just maybe 3 years ago, and I've been in the field for at least 11 years now. And she'll be like, why don't you be a teacher? Oh, this person's a teacher. And, she gets paid well. I'm like, Mom, you do know I get paid more than a teacher, right? Like, it's actually, well, in some degree, like, it's pretty good, like, with what I have, especially since I started my behavior roots company. But there's something about her being stuck with very traditional, familiar roles, even if it doesn't pay much, right? That she's like, she wants me to revert back to that. And like, even if I get paid more, even if I'm happier in this, right? I don't know if happiness is part of that equation when they consider our careers, but I remember actually in high school, I wanted to be a dancer, and my mom's like, no, you cannot pursue, you can't. So I danced for like several years from elementary to high school. And then my mom's like, you need to stop. You're not going to make any money being a dancer. You need to change and focus on something else, which I think psychology was not that much helpful. But like, I think she was less resistant compared to being in dance. So yeah, it's interesting.
That is really interesting. We had similar backgrounds.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like they were that resistant, but also like we both kind of, it sounds like we got this like, well, no, this is not going to make money. You need to pick something else, right?
Oh yeah.
That's such a big deal for them.
Yeah, the teacher route definitely was pushed on me too. So
Yeah, that's so interesting because we know like with teachers like it's a lot for teachers. Yeah. Okay. That's really interesting. So, I guess leading into the next question, I guess with our upbringing, I think, our upbringing might be a little different since you're Vietnamese and I'm Chinese, but I know like I want to talk about code switching a little. So what I mean by that is like, switching kind of our tone, our body language, just maybe culturally of what feels appropriate
mhm.
depending on the space or the environment that we're in. So I don't know if you have any insight or input on like, do you feel like you have to code switch? Do you feel you act the same in all environments, whether that's within a more Asian friendly or non-Asian friendly environment? Or do you even feel like you see that at all in our ABA field?
I do. I see that a lot. And I tend to code switch, especially when it comes to families.
Mm,
For the Vietnamese culture, it's that first impression is everything. And so you want to put up like a really great first impression. So for me, I'm a little more timid, a little more like respectable when it comes to like talking to Asian families or even like meeting new people in the beginning. And then as I get comfortable with them, I become a little bit more direct and more, yeah, more direct when it comes to people. And so I know that in the past, giving feedback to therapists can be a little more, I can be a little more abrasive, and so I've had to learn how to scale it back in order to like be a little more tactful, because they're like, Christina, that doesn't really fly, or like they kind of go to talk to HR or something about how I provide feedback. And so I know that for me, that's how I've had to learn how to be a better supervisor and understanding, okay, there are cultural differences. On top of the fact that the body language, in a Western centric setting, people are more like, I want to say touchy feely, but like just hugs, and um, those type of stuff. Like I'm not really, I didn't grow up having a lot of hugs. And so when people hug me, I've had to learn how to be able to accept it, um, and just be able to be okay. And being able to be open about saying, hey, I'm not a hugger, or like you have to ask for a hug type of thing.
Yeah.
So things like that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like that's my answer because I relate so much to that, and probably even more that I could add on to that. But yeah, yeah, I do at least, and again within Chinese culture, I feel like I grew up very you speak very gentle, um, and you're more quiet, right? You only speak when there's kind of that quiet space or there's a lot of space to speak up. I have found like, especially in my younger years, like I feel like in Western culture, they're just very they have no problem just like inserting themselves and just like having nonstop conversation to some degree without pauses. And I realized growing up, oh, I'm not actually accustomed to that. I think that's also why Asians can come across very quiet, when in reality, I feel like sometimes it is just a cultural difference because I know I experienced that where like it's not that I don't have things to say in meetings or group settings. It's more of like I'm not used to just like barging in and inserting my opinion, right? I'm used to either you ask me or it's a very almost like take your turn type of thing, which is very ironic because, and I think this is also in Vietnamese culture, but it's like when you translate the language in Chinese, it is quite direct sometimes, right? So it's, I feel like if you translate Chinese to English, it sounds very harsh or overly direct or abrasive, when in reality, I mean, it's not in Chinese language, for example, right? But I think like I've had to learn to like, even in my own relationships or with my husband, I have to like, oh, when I talk a certain way, I'm like, no, 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 you need to do this. But it's just so direct. But like for us, that's so normal because we're not being rude. That's literally how you would communicate within that Chinese and Asian tone. But obviously, like you said, like if I'm speaking to American people or within a Western culture, I learned to soften and be very like gentle and like careful with my tone and careful with like so many things because I think they're definitely to some degree that's valued more in terms of what's considered respectful, what's considered like rude or different meanings and labels to that.
Yeah, yeah. Speak when you're spoken to was what I was taught.
Yeah, yeah, kind of almost that authoritarian way
Yeah,
of like that. The hierarchy also, right? Of like
yeah,
with elders, you don't just go up and just talk whenever you want type of thing.
right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, well, the last question I have within kind of our upbringing and professional identity is, and this one I'm asking because I actually relate a lot with this one, is like the language of care. So, in many Asian households, for those who may not know, saying I love you is not a normal common thing, right? Love language in terms of words and words of affirmation is just not, I think, prominent. I think actions typically are, right? Um, but like cutting fruit or giving you a hot meal, even without saying anything, that's like how we felt loved. Verbal praise is like literally non-existent. But I found that interesting, especially whether that's like in this field or as I've gotten older and becoming more immersed or more American, that social praise or like when we talk about like verbal praise, that's like good job or wow, you're amazing. That you tried so hard or like very positive affirmation words. Like, do you feel like that comes natural to you? And do you feel like that's impacted kind of your interventions or methods as a BCBA?
Um, It's funny because I've grown to provide praise and everything, like especially in this field, you provide a lot of praise. And so for me, that becomes like second nature to provide praise to like not only my clients, but to like colleagues, friends, and loved ones and stuff. But when it comes to like accepting those types of praises, I've had to learn to accept it. For me, it was just like I'm not so used to praise. And so I was like, yeah, like it's expected of me to do that. And so for me to be praised about that, I've had to learn to say thank you and appreciate the
Mhm.
gesture and then move on,
Yeah.
So it's been a huge learning process in terms of being able to accept praise for myself.
Mm, yeah. Did you grow up with verbal praise or I love yous?
Not really. No, not really. And so that was again, for my family, it was just more giving,
Yeah.
caring for their children was the way they showed love and care and stuff. And so for me, I didn't really get that like physical or like the verbal praise. It was, I think, 2 years ago my mom finally said, I'm proud of you.
Yeah. Mhm.
so so yeah, it's been a learning process to like I even have to remind myself like say thank you when somebody like gives me praise,
Yeah.
so that they know that I'm genuine about it as opposed to being like, yeah, I'm supposed to be doing that.
Yeah, like I don't know if like in your culture, like Vietnamese, they say this, but it's like if somebody were to say like, "Oh, your hair's so pretty," or "You did such an amazing job," like the automatic reaction in like Chinese, like, "Oh no, 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 no," like that, no,
Yes.
no, no, like that's not me, or like the immediate reaction is to deny it actually, and that's considered or perceived humble and like the appropriate response. And yeah, I don't
Yes.
know if you experience that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, my initial inclination is like, no, 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 it's okay.
Yeah,
Or like,
yeah,
Vietnamese is so great. No, 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 I'm still learning. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. No, and I agree. I think, again, very similarly to you, I've struggled. Like, it's been a skill. I've literally had to train myself over the years. And obviously, I've gotten better because I have had to intentionally practice this,
Yeah.
is saying things like thank you when people give me a compliment, or yeah, like whether that's within interventions and I'm modeling an intervention, I'm saying giving like effort praise, right? Like different things. I will say though, by me practicing that and modeling it, especially within my work, it's naturally helped me to talk, kind of like generalize that skill to talk in my personal relationships that way
Yep.
too. So it's
Yep.
become easier for me to accept compliments like from friends, right? And to give positive verbal praise to my husband, like for efforts that he's made, right? So things like that where it's really but I've been able to generalize it, which has actually been nice.
Yeah. Same. Same. Even accepting gifts is like really hard for me too. I'm like, you're supposed to reject it.
Yeah. Like same with paying the bill, right? You reject at least two, three times and then maybe, but like you don't accept it the first time. That's almost like, what?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just watched a video of like in China, like these men who literally physically fought over the counter, physically, like five men just to fight over a bill, right? People were like climbing over the counters and stuff because it was like that's seen as a sign of like, hey, I value you, I care about you, and this is respectful.
hmm
Okay, let's continue on because I have some other questions and the next one is kind of on cultural dissonance within our clinical practice. So I wanted to talk a little bit about individualism versus collectivism. And I think in Western culture, but even within ABA, I think a lot of it is prioritized as like independence. Like that's the core is like whether we want a child to be independent, right? Which of course makes sense. But I think it's influenced even more with such a individualistic culture within the Western society and lens. And so I don't know, do you feel like that impacts how you navigate programming? Um, when a family's like cultural value might be rooted in collectivism versus individualism?
Yeah, initially I had a hard time understanding it just because growing up in a Western society, and everybody was like individualized. When I've gone into homes where families are like they're generation homes, where the grandparents were taking care of their grandkids and things like that. It was kind of difficult for me to understand, okay, what's going on? Why are they still feeding their kid when they're like 5 and 6 years old? Um, and so for me, I've had to learn how to navigate and understand where their household, their rules are. And so for me, it was just kind of like taking a step back and being like, if that is how they feel like needed and that's how they care and show love for their children and for those around in their households, then I'm going to respect their culture in that aspect. But I would talk to parents about like, oh, thinking about long term and what their goals are. If their focus is on communication, that's where my focus was, and didn't have to worry about like a lot of those adaptive skills in terms of independent skills and things like that. Being able to show the parents that their child can do a lot, and if they still wanted to do it for their kid, I wasn't going to fight it for it, and rather focus on what was what the family's values were.
Mm, mm. Yeah. Yeah, I think I agree. And I think understanding those cultural values is so important. And I feel like honestly, it should be part of the assessment, right? Like
Hmm.
ethics code, right? Is just like
Yep.
understanding like what are your values and how might that look different than just like every day. And because I think when we think of ACT, I think of ACT like values of like connection and family is a value. But I mean, like, what are the cultural values? Like, that's a
Hmm.
whole different subset, I think, that we often neglect or forget to think about and ask and really understand too. So, not even just collecting data on it, but to understand like, do we know what that looks like? Have we reached out to other people within the same ethnicity to see what that looks like?
Hmm.
And, I think the biggest thing I think of is like people who in Chinese culture or Asian culture, like it's very common that even when you're 20s, you still live with your parents,
Yeah.
right? And until you get married, then maybe you go off and live with your spouse. But even then, in some Asian countries, they will still actually find a home where everyone lives together, or there's some like connection, right? Where the
Hmm.
family or the parents are close by. And I know people in Asia where, yeah, they get married, but then they actually have a house where like the parents and everyone still lives together, even after getting married. And I feel like that's so common. And so what I think about is like when we're teaching independent skills, is like, you know, yes, we teach. I mean, obviously, this depends on the individual that we're supporting, but like independence is such a subjective word, I feel like,
Right.
right? So it can be defined very differently. Like for us, independence could be like learning like toilet training, learning how to use the
Hmm.
restroom independently, which yes, hopefully we should and can teach a skill like that. But
Hmm.
then it can get a little murky when it comes to like if you're working, say, like with a adult who's autistic, who's 18 or 20 years old, but they come from an Asian family, right?
Hmm.
Then that might look a little different in terms of what does independence actually look like? Because if we're teaching them skills like how to pay your bills and we're thinking like, oh, they need to get their own place. Well, like
Right.
maybe that's something we need to ask the caregivers. Like, is that even something on your mind that you would want? Because for
Hmm.
some Asian caregivers, that's not on the forefront. Not even just
Yep.
the fact that like they might need to care for their son or daughter, but just the fact a cultural lens of like, wait, we wouldn't do that. Like, why would they move out and live on their own type of thing?
Right.
Yeah. Um, okay, so I have a second question in terms of culture. Something to do with like kind of like language. nuance. So I don't know if you have a lot of clients that you've worked with where English was not their primary language. But I'm curious if you have, or if that's common, like how you might have handled behavioral terms or how you taught or discussed certain goals or strategies, or did you feel like you had to adjust any because of any cultural background?
It's interesting when this question comes up because when I look at it, I don't know how if it's the same with the Chinese cultures, but especially in America, I've noticed a lot of Vietnamese Americans, there's a disconnect between parents and child, where the parents are very fluent in Vietnamese, very limited English, but their children are growing up speaking English. And so there's a lot of miscommunication or lack of communication between parent and child because of it. A lot of times there could be like an older sibling, if there's an older daughter who is bilingual, and so she'll translate for her parents to other kids, and vice versa. And that not only happens in like in terms of experiencing it with like the autistic population, but in general, you know. And so I've noticed that there's not a lot kids who are learning Vietnamese in America nowadays, just because there really isn't much of a need since they speak English, you know, in the community. They speak English to their friends. They speak English to um, sometimes their relatives and stuff like that. And so they've never really had to learn Vietnamese.
Yeah.
Luckily, I was living in California for a while, and I made it a point to work with like Vietnamese families. And through working with Vietnamese families, I've been able to improve my Vietnamese and like learn some like technical terms. But sometimes
Hmm.
when I wasn't like I may have forgotten some of the words, I would like speak around it or describe it. And so it'd be like instead of saying like stereotypy or repetitive behavior, I'd be like, oh, does your child like clap their hands a lot or do they sing a lot and things like that so that they kind of understand like what I was talking about. And so that's how I started improving my Vietnamese in terms of more of like a formal approach as well as like that informal colloquial approach to Vietnamese.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah. You know, okay, I don't know if this is going off topic, but like it's funny because I know when I worked in San Francisco areas, which is actually where I started my career, I had like a decent amount of Asian clients, right? A lot of them were Filipino. One was Chinese, which was I was like, wow, I've honestly never had a Chinese client. I feel like, especially within Chinese, I feel like even probably more so than Vietnamese, like it is so taboo to like
Oh yeah.
say like I have a child with who's
Yep.
autistic or like that's just it just they wouldn't even seek out services. Like that's
Mhm.
just very common where like it's such a shame, it's such a taboo that like they probably wouldn't even ask for services even if it was free just
Mhm.
because of the image that it creates. So for me to encounter Asian clients, I was like, wow, this is I think I was just surprised and but
Mhm.
also honored. Um, but yeah, it's interesting. I would say for me to answer this question, I feel like I do almost code switch if especially it's an Asian family, right? Because like
Yeah.
you just know, and they get it too, right? They probably honestly feel more connected with you because you're Asian. You don't even need to be
Yep.
the same Asian ethnicity. They just like, right? They just
Yep.
naturally feel more connected because you're Asian, and I can
Yep.
feel it, right? There's this unspoken connection, and it's funny because I can immediately see myself when I was working with that Asian client. They were Cantonese, but I'm Taiwanese, but still, like, I would talk more directly with them and I wouldn't worry about them getting offended because I
Mm.
knew that they understood, like, the way that we talk is like that's kind of how you talk. In
Mhm.
Cantonese language, I feel like, and probably Vietnamese, well, I know in Cantonese, like, their language is even more. like harsh, like it sounds like a harsh tone, like the
Yes.
way they speak, but it's not actually harsh, right? But
Right.
it's like the way your intonation. And so I think I'm just accustomed to that. And so I remember like code switching a little with that. But I also feel like in terms of discussing goals and strategies, so I actually have a Chinese caregivers that I train, and I do training with them. And a lot of times when I'm trying to explain what I'm working on with their daughter, and why I'm working on those different things, I'm actually providing an explanation. Like in Chinese culture it's very like I'll relate to them. And that's because I had that advantage and I can. So for an example, emotions, which is going to be our next topic, but like in Chinese culture, I think it's common in Vietnamese culture too, where like they just dismiss emotions. Like it is right.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I think like they were Americanized enough or had been in America long enough where if I were to explain that like, hey, in Asian culture, when this happens, our immediate reaction is to like, whatever, just throw it under the rug or it's you just like jump to the next solution, right? That is so common in Asian culture. So I explain that to them, and then I explain like this is what's healthy, and this is what we want your daughter to express or to how we want her to process, right? And I show them the stark difference of that response, right? Because for them, a lot of times, I think it's so natural. It's such a like common sense thing that they don't realize that, oh, we need to respond differently to emotions. What is that, right? Like, and so that's like even little things like I'll explain the strategies and the goals that I have, and I try my best to give those relatable examples so they get more of those aha moments of like, oh, interesting. I didn't think of that, or I didn't realize by ignoring them or telling them what's your grade score that it could shame them. Yeah, because grades are such a big thing, right?
Yes.
Um, that I was like, yeah, like a statement like that could shame them. And like, how does that cause shame? Like, that's emotional language is just not in our generation, our parents' generation's cultural upbringing, because they went through a lot. But I think that's kind of like I'm definitely more nuanced with how I explain the goals, especially if they're Asian. But I would say I've worked with Ethiopian families and other ethnicities, and I realized Ethiopian families are actually kind of similar to Asians. I don't know if you,
Yeah.
yeah, I learned that because I worked with so many. Like they're also very like, with their communication, they're very like functional to the point, efficient in some degree, and that's how Asian culture is when we communicate. It's like leave the fluff out. You just kind of like talk about what's necessary. I realize like they're very similar. They have very
Ah,
similar
okay.
cultures. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to make sure we get to this because it's my favorite topic is emotional regulation. I think it's something we were both talking about previous to this recording, how much we have really in our own personal journeys have probably worked on a lot, right?
Mhm.
So I think in Asian culture, we know it's pretty common where stoicism is a very common variable, where many of us were raised in an environment where emotional regulation kind of essentially meant emotional suppression, like that was
Mhm.
considered healthy, right?
Yeah.
And I'm curious, like, how did you navigate that growing up, or did you experience that growing up? And how does that influence maybe how you see emotions today or how you manage them today?
Oof. It's been
Loaded question.
a growing process. I mean, um, even now, I'm still learning how to regulate my emotions. So it's been kind of nuanced because part of it has been like that emotional regulation. In the past, it's been like I don't want to talk about the past. I don't, pushing down anything sad, anything like that angers you, that's all like, no, it has to be positive, it has to be happy. Has been like what I've been taught in the past. We never really talked about our emotions and even as in the family dynamic, I even have right now I'm learning to talk to my brother about our emotions and stuff. I can't, in the past, I can tell my parents like, oh, I have depression. They're like, what is that? Like just kind of suck it up
Yeah.
mentality. But on the flip side of that coin is just being able to, a lot of Vietnamese personality is just kind of, I guess, more of like a very defensive, feedback is given, and you immediately, or I immediately become defensive about it. And so I've had to learn how to regulate my emotions in terms of taking a step back, absorbing that feedback, and not trying not to make it taking it too personal, because in the past it's like, oh, I can't believe you're judging my character or like my own personality. It's very, I want to say like disrespectful. But so me being able to take feedback and learning how to regulate my emotions has been like a huge journey where, nowadays I'm using the calming techniques I'm teaching my kids and stuff,
Yeah.
counting down, being able to track my emotions and just being able to like sit in them. I know that recently I've been listening to a Vietnamese Buddhist monk about mindfulness and just being present with whatever I'm dealing with or whatever I'm doing, to be in the moment. And so that's also been helping me understand that, to sit with my emotions as
Yeah.
opposed to being reactive about it.
Yeah. It's a lot of retraining our
Oh,
upbringing, retraining the brain. Yeah, like
shaping.
yes, lots of individual shaping for ourselves.
Yes.
Yeah, I feel like, I mean, very similarly. I mean, I grew up where emotions in general, emotional regulation, like that was not even a word I learned until like my 30s, honestly. That was really a non-existent term or concept that I ever thought of because, yeah, emotions were just not something you talked about. Um, I've definitely never heard my parents or just families or relatives in general say like, I feel sad, I'm mad, or like that is to express that is just not a normal thing. I think that is common in Asian families, and obviously yeah, I grew up where especially Asian men, lots of stoicism, right? You hear like the man the dad provides, he cooks and cleans, but it's like a man of very little words in some
Yeah.
ways, like
Yes.
not very conversational. You don't just sit down and chat with them and have long
Yes.
conversations. Um,
Yes.
I mean, I didn't
Yeah.
have that with my mom either, but like I think that's just we just know that's common. And yeah, I think I mentioned this one last time in a recording, but like these are skills that I feel like I never learned. And so it wasn't until I hit rock bottom with a lot of things in my personal life that I realized like I actually have to learn how to regulate my emotions. I actually have to learn how to express my emotions and say, I feel blank, right? So, learned a lot of that from therapy, learned a lot of that, like you said, from like ABA, doing those interventions, especially as I became trauma informed. And I think it's honestly a big part of what I love doing is like as I'm training and teaching people on emotions and emotional literacy, I'm practicing this myself too,
Yeah.
which is like actually it's like a two in one. I love it because it doesn't come natural to me, but I know it's important and I know I need to practice it. So yeah, these are like skills that I'm now teaching myself and trying to apply. And like you said, it's because we didn't grow up with this for so long, even into adulthood, it's like we have to practice this regularly, daily,
Yeah.
and we mess up. And then what do? We shame ourselves, right? And then we're like
Yes.
hard on ourselves because shame is very common in Asian culture. We don't have a label for it, right? But like, I'll think like, oh, what's wrong with me? And then, it's such this like weird balance of like, okay, I'm trying to learn how to be more open with my emotions, but then I'm like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I do this? Like, it's so frustrating. Um,
Yes, yes.
yeah.
All of that, and just like that feeling of not being good enough all the time,
Yes.
plays a huge part in it. It wasn't until I put myself into therapy where, my therapist was like, you need to be nicer to yourself. And I'm like, I don't know how to do
What does
that.
that look
What
like? Yeah.
does that mean?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's such a good question. Like, be nicer to yourself. A good statement. Because I think and I know it's not just Asian culture, but I do think
Yeah.
that's such a prominent thing where like we don't, just like how you're saying it's hard to receive a thank you, right? Like we
Mhm.
don't know how to be nice to ourselves. We know how to be critical, right? I think of like the Asian parents, like you get a 78. Why'd you get a 78? Right? Like that's a very, or in regards to emotions, like I think of like I have this habit that I know I get from my mom, which is a very Asian thing, is like whenever, say, my husband or anyone comes up with a problem, my first instinct is like, oh, it's probably this. You probably didn't do this enough. You know, like our automatic instinct is to jump to a solution of like, you probably didn't do this. It's probably because of this, right? It's probably because you
Yeah.
didn't sleep enough. And like, we have to somehow come to a solution like right away and problem solve.
Yeah.
The more softer, I guess, westernized therapy approach would be like, oh, that sounds really hard, or like, you know what I'm like, that is such a hard response for me to say because it's just so opposite of what I grew up with.
Yes. And being like the hypercritical person.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, one more question with emotions and processing. Um, I guess like image and like saving face, I feel like in Asian cultures is so ingrained and so common where a lot of actions that our parents engage in, especially in that generation, they do it to kind of save face and keeping up a certain image with
Yeah.
it. And I don't know if that's a collectivism thing, right? It's just like, it's almost like your family is a representation of the whole entire race, the whole entire community. It's not like just the people within your immediate blood, right? And so I feel like it's such a huge pressure that we have. I don't know if have you ever felt like make if you've made a professional mistake or struggle to protect your profession, like if you did something that you messed up on, like do you feel like you struggle with admitting that or kind of saying like this was hard or like it's okay that I made this mistake?
In the past, if you'd asked me this like 15 years ago, I probably would have said no, like not knowing how to navigate this in terms of like in terms of the making a mistake. Like in the past, I would have said I would have gotten defensive about it and just been like, no, like you're wrong, I didn't make a mistake. It was because of this, this, and this type of thing. And it was less of accountability and more of like defending like who I was. And I felt I would have felt more attacked by the feedback. Nowadays, I will take accountability. Like if I mess up, I'll be like, I'm so sorry. And also too just being able to apologize for what I did. And in the past, like I would have like apologized just to appease people. Um, because the other side of it is that you never want to hurt anybody, and so you're just kind of like, I'm so sorry, you're constantly apologizing for something you didn't even do, just to make other people happy. And that's also like that Vietnamese culture of um the the term would be like, oh, I don't want to make you sad. And so a lot of people will be like, instead of trying to make people sad, they'll be like, oh, so sorry, it's okay, type of thing, and just kind of brush it off. So that in terms of my professional work and my career, I've learned to be like, hey, thank you for the feedback, or like, I'm so sorry I did this. I'll try to work on it too. And trying not to make it an attack of like of worthlessness, like I'm a horrible person for doing this, I suck at my job, basically, type of thing. It's just kind of like, this is gonna, being able to tell myself that this is how I grow, is to take that feedback. So again, a learning process of like being able to retrain your brain of saying like you're not worthless because you made this mistake.
Yeah, I think that's really, really big, like, and it takes a lot of humility and courage to recognize that and to work
Yeah.
on something like that. And it takes a lot of kindness to ourselves, right?
Yep.
I'm sure yeah, and I think as much as I would love to say, like, oh, being seen as a failure and feeling not good enough is an Asian thing, which it is, but I think it's not even just within the Asian culture. I think we know in the field it's very common for people to have imposter syndrome or to
Yep.
feel like they're not doing enough or they're doing it wrong or they're incompetent in some way. And I think, like, if I think about it from a cultural perspective, when I mess up, I'm thinking about in the past, like, I wouldn't say I'm not like thinking of my ethnicity, right?
Mhm.
It's such a natural internalization that I'm like, I did something wrong. It's my fault,
Yeah.
right? And I think that's like, we also know where a lot of the defensiveness does come up is like, because we internalize someone's statement or feedback. And then the defensiveness comes up because we've taken it personally. Like it's literally become like, this is my value. This is like my worth, right?
Hmm.
And we don't know
Hmm.
how to separate the two.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like I've experienced a lot of that in my personal life as an Asian, where just my life did not turn out the way I hoped, and then there's a lot of kind of shame within
Yeah.
the Chinese culture, and to the point my mom, like, actually, it's very common. She's like, "Don't tell anyone this," right? Like,
Oh, yes,
right?
yes,
That's such a
yes,
common statement. I'm like, why? But I mean, I guess it's just that's such a common thing for them to just want to represent, like we're all put together.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah.
And I
My
do
mom,
feel like that is where a lot of my previous like people pleasing, perfectionism, like a lot of those things stem from is like I have to look like I have it all together,
yeah.
right? In order to seem like a good professional or competent or whatever or successful, right?
Yep. Yeah. Even my appearance plays a part in it too, because it's like I have to look put together, or else people will judge how I look or like what I say based on it. So
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. All right. We have maybe time for two more questions. Maybe I'll ask, I wanted to touch on we have I had a section on like parent family training and kind of
mhm,
nuanced approaches to that. And I don't know if I'm trying to think like building rapport in terms of what that might look like or how that's interpreted as respect. So, like in your experience, are there any like unwritten rules for gaining trust with like a Asian matriarch or patriarch type of household that you feel like we could contribute because it's not necessarily taught or discussed in ABA textbooks?
yeah. In terms of the building rapport and like kind of building the parents' trust, it's for me, of course, you have to take off your shoes, but also being able to be more respectful of the family home. And so for me, instead of just kind of assuming that we can kind of roam around the home, like if we're doing home health type of situation, you have to kind of ask parents, okay, where should we situate ourselves? And if it's just in the living room, we stay in the living room, we don't move around. And then just being able to build that trust that way and being able to show them that we can be respectful of the area, being able to clean up after ourselves. And if and then as the and if parents are being more hands-on or like watching our session, they can, because I know that there's a lot of distrust when it comes to guests in the home and stuff. And so just being able to be respectful in that aspect, as we grow there, as we build our trust with them and pair with the family, that's when they'll be more comfortable and be like, okay, here's water for you, you know. Even the first day, they're like, here's a bottle of water, and you just take it and you go, you know. I've had families who will like chase people down if they don't take their bottle of water.
Yeah.
So things like that, just being able to be like, thank you, um, can continue to work in that aspect. Um, yeah, so that's where I've built the trust. And it's kind of interesting because sometimes I kind of feel that because of the saving face, you know, you just kind of want to continue to be professional because the more comfortable you get, that's when the minute you start messing up, you know, the parent just kind of gets really upset and they'll be like, I don't want you in the home anymore. So
Mm,
you just kind of have to stay professional in that professional aspect in order to maintain that relationship with the family, even though they're like, come on, you know, we're both Asians, you know, just be comfortable in our homes. It's like, I'm sorry, I can't do that, you know. I don't
mm.
know if you've experienced that in the past.
Yeah, yeah. I have, yeah. I think these are everything you shared were really good tips. Yeah, and I have definitely experienced that. And I would add to that, I'm just thinking like, you know how Asians are very big on actions, and that's how we
Yes.
show we care. So like let's say like again, taking a cup of water would be potentially respectful, right, in an Asian household. But also, like, I feel like I could see more Western, like, oh, like, let's say they want to, like, clean up the toys or they want to, like, put away dishes or water or your cup or whatever. And I could see in a Western approach being like, oh, you don't have to do that, right? But I feel
Yeah.
like in Asian culture, like, no. They want, like, it's actually, you know what I'm talking about? It's
Yeah.
actually respectful to let them do it, right? Like,
Yes. Yes.
even because I feel like, you know, Americans are like so great, like, oh, it's okay, don't worry about it. Like, but in Asia, like, no, 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 like, we want to put away this, we want to serve you, and we want to like do all these things, right?
Right,
Like, that
right.
is like, it makes them feel needed, which I don't even think is
Yes.
a healthy thing, right? But like, it is essential, like, that's what feels good, and it makes them feel needed, especially, like, I think the mothers.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of when you're sharing. And like, I would say to add to the rapport, I know, and again, it depends on do the caregivers speak English fluently, right?
Hmm.
What generation are they, and different things like that. But obviously, just the smaller things of like slowing your tone, talking in basic terminology,
Yeah.
um, just talking as simplistic as possible. I've done that a lot
Yeah.
with a lot of caregivers who I know English is not their first language. And I also use a lot of images, right, when I explain
Hmm.
things because images are so much easier to understand when there is a cultural difference of understanding another language,
Hmm.
besides just me like talking. But I definitely make sure I slow down my talking and really meeting them where they're at, right? I
Yeah.
think it's really important to just like they recognize that we recognize like this is a lot for them, or
Yeah.
they may not over understand everything, or it might be really overwhelming.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great way to build rapport with them, but also to kind of understand them as well. Um, I had another one, but I can't think of it. But yeah, yeah, I think those are some great ways. And like you said, taking the shoes off, ideally, honestly, accepting like a small gift, right? It doesn't need to be like a $50 thing, right? But like
Yeah.
water, anything like that. Again, when they feel needed, I feel like they feel connected to you in some way.
Yes. Yes.
Um, okay, so I think we only really have time for maybe like one or two more questions. So
Okay.
I'll go down to kind of we're gonna end with, I guess, focusing on kind of like what it means to raise your voice and what that narrative looks like. So I guess like for you and your identity, did you ever feel like that your Asian identity was either like a superpower or strength in the field rather than something to be minimized? Did you ever even experience that, or did you not even maybe think about it at all? Because, and I say this because I believe I had the statistics somewhere, and let me find it because I want to share this in the recording. So I think, according to the BACB data, there's only, we as Asians represent only about 6 to 8% within the BCBA, BACB field. But I
Mhm.
don't know if like being Asian ever, came up in terms of your work.
It did in some aspects and it didn't in other aspects. Like I said, when I was living in Orange County, I did work for a company that had primarily a lot of Vietnamese speaking clients. And so because of that, I was only a mid-tier supervisor at that time, but that my client base went from like 11 to 20 clients at one point. We're not going to get to um, the background of that, but it was just like there was such a need for it, and so I never had to, and I it kind of felt like a superpower in that aspect because I felt like I was helping the Vietnamese community in Orange County, working with these clients and stuff. And so that in that aspect, um, I felt like it was my way of contributing and like my altruistic way of helping out the Vietnamese community in that aspect. But in that same sense, I've been in like other companies where I was the only Asian person in that company, and for me, it was kind of like my way of squeezing myself into, in that chair and that table, so that I can be a little bit like, hey, I can be here too. And sometimes um, my voice was heard, and other times I felt kind of like dismissed, And I know I'm not really quite sure if it was like my race or whatever, but it was just kind of like, okay, well, I don't know if I my voice even matters in this aspect. So there have been times where I felt that way too, and kind of feeling a little uncomfortable at times where I was the only Asian person or like, you know, um, color, BIPOC person in that space too. So it's been, I've been able to experience both.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with you. I think it's not like I've experienced racism or
Yeah.
microaggressions, honestly, to per se in the field, but yeah, it's like really obvious when you're the only Asian, right? So it does feel a little like you're standing out.
Mhm.
I remember when I started my career in ABA, which was in San Francisco area, there were so many Asians at the company that I worked at, and and I think so. This was coming from Georgia, which is where I moved from. And
Mhm.
Georgia's like, yes, there are Asians, but not that many, not compared to the West Coast, right? And so I was like literally culture shocked with how many Asian females there were at my company. And it was like, oh my, like I couldn't, I'm like, it's like I just felt an immediate connection. I don't know if it's like if you've been to places where there are not too many Asians. So when you see an Asian, you almost like you like connect or you look at them because they're just purely because they're Asian.
Right,
Because
right.
it's just like, ooh, another Asian, right? And
Yeah.
how I felt, I was like, wow. And I kind of got used to it. But then I had moved back to Georgia. And then Georgia, I was like, is also when I started my company, but I still was in the clinical field. And when I did supervision, regardless, whatever it was, I think I met within the 7 years of living there, I met one Asian.
Oh, wow.
And 7 years, if you think about it, like I got so accustomed to some degree of being the only Asian. And yeah, I also found like sometimes when I was at school meetings, for example, and this is where I talked about like not speaking up as much. It's not that I felt unheard, right? Kind of like what you're saying. It was more of like I didn't always feel like I got the opportunity to
Yep.
completely speak what was on my mind or my input. And I didn't really know when or where to insert myself because, again, it was just everyone's just like throwing their input in. And I'm like kind of waiting for my turn. But then I realized, oh, there is no my turn. Like I kind of just had to throw myself in. That is when I feel, I think, the most, I recognize my Asianness. I'm
Yes.
like, oh, that's a cultural thing. I forget. Like I have to be a bit more assertive and aggressive in some ways to kind
Yeah.
of get my voice heard in this meeting. Um, but yeah, I think in terms of whether this is a strength or superpower, whatever you want to call it, I am proud that we are we've selected this field, right? Despite our parents being like, I want you to be a doctor, a lawyer, a traditional role, right? And we still chose to be in this field because we're passionate about it and because
Mhm.
we see the benefits and
Yep.
um, I am proud that like as Asians, we were able to make that choice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. And to contribute in some way of like being able to disseminate the field of behavior analysis into like an AAPI community and saying like, hey, there are some of us out there, you know.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Amazing. Thank you, Christina. This was such an amazing talk. I'm gonna stop here since we're at time, and I will stop the recording. But for those who are listening, this does count as one ethics CEU that you can access on my website, behaviorroots.com.